Liz, you got the picture reversed, have you? That is unusual. Is anybody else getting that? Because that's not happening at my end, but obviously it did happen at my end the other week. So how strange that is. It's a strange old world of technology we live in, but hopefully whichever one works, whether it be the TV or the phone, if you can watch on that one. And I think we're about 2 o'clock, so I think we're going to kick off. So picture's good, fantastic. So we're starting today, we're going to talk about York in the 18th century. So it might be a surprise then that I've decided to start our tour by the castle, which I've brought into many a tour. And the reason is even though the castle is a symbol of conquest of course by the Normans, the latter part of the 11th century, 1066 and all that, in many respects it represents the beginning of a golden age for York, cementing its place as the second city of England, a place of 2 castles, a treasury, of course with the cathedral, the archbishop, a marrying up of sort of ecclesiastical, royal and civic power and military might, as well as trading with its links to the continent, the wool trade, textiles. For several centuries it enjoyed unparalleled success and wealth. But by the beginning of the 18th century, around by 1700, that all looked very, very different. They'd had a torrid 150 years. That of course starts with the Reformation, the changes to the, if you like, the faith makeup of the country, to pilgrimages being banned in the 1530s, take away huge amounts of wealth from York. There is of course the small matter of the Wars of the Roses, where they find themselves on the wrong side of a civil war. Of course backing the Plantagenets, the House of York, but it is of course the Tudors, the House of Lancaster that succeeds, black mark against York. Unfortunately it happens again with the English Civil War in the middle part of the 17th century. York is a royalist stronghold. It's laid siege here in 1644. Okay, so it emerges once again on the wrong side. To add insult to injury, you got the problems with the Catholics. Guy Fawkes, of course, and 3 of the main conspirators are from York. The north is seen as a place of Catholic refuseniks. So there's all sorts of black marks, but perhaps the biggest of them all is a kind of change in geopolitics, the emergence of the new world. York had established itself with its location by the banks of the River Ouse, connecting to the North Sea, to the Low Countries, to Holland, Belgium, Denmark, France. But of course trade now moves towards the new world, to the colonies. And so it's the ports of the West that begin to capitalise, like so Bristol, Liverpool. These are the ports that trade with the Americas. And I suppose the final blow to York is the loss of the Council of the North, established by Richard III in 1483 to govern the North. So as York came into the beginnings of the 18th century, the future was looking far from certain. It no longer enjoyed its position of natural prominence, particularly, as I say, following the abolition of the Council of the North. It was no longer the seat of government in the North. And of course, the idea of it being an occasional residence of the court had pretty much finished when Charles I had treated it as his royal city. It was very much out of favour. And now in York in this time, many opportunities for advancement and business were lost, and it became a lot harder to make a fortune in York. But for those already here, it became their playground. However, York remained the county town of Yorkshire and still drew great importance from its role as a centre for justice. So we're looking at York County Jail, one of the first big projects of the 18th century. So York Castle, that it forms part of, had long been a place of the Crown's justice and punishment. But at the turn of the 18th century, facilities were brought right up to date here with this major new prison building. It was described by Daniel Defoe, the author that wrote Robinson Crusoe, as the most stately and complete of any in the kingdom, if not in Europe. And it was initially a home to debtors, those who'd been in prison for failing to pay their bills. But the prison also housed some of Yorkshire's most notorious criminals, such as, of course, the highwayman Dick Turpin. The architect was a chap by the name of William Wakefield, a trained lawyer rather than professional architect. He was a native of Yorkshire, and Wakefield is known to have designed Duncan Park and Gilling Castle, so left quite a footprint in this area. Now the finished building was a handsome early example of the English Baroque, perfectly built to kind of reflect county pride. And Nicholas Pevsner, the great architectural writer, said, "This building is next after the Minster, the most monumental of York." The tower has an unusual clock with only one hand. I think I can go a bit of zoom on there. Only got one hand. And it was installed in 1716 by a clockmaker by the name of John Terry. And for a while at least, the prison served its purpose in a modern and functional way, with separate areas for men and women. The debtors were housed upstairs and the felons down below. However, the prison quickly fell into kind of overcrowding and the conditions became unbearable. Escapes were made and new smaller cells were built. The story of the inmates is now told in an exhibition in the Castle Museum. You can go in and hear all about that. But it's not new that this was, if you like, a site of tourism, because in its heyday it was a visitor attraction in its own right. Now, promenading gentry were able to view the inmates behind the railings of the excise yard. So where we are stood now, at one time in the 18th century, would have been populated by the gentry in all their finery, looking to catch a view of the felons trapped inside. And of course, it was a huge attraction once they found out that Dick Turpin was here in 1739, and many paid to come and view England's most wanted man in his cell. And in those days, prisons were in effect private enterprises. So the jailer did a deal with Turpin to split the money in between. Now Dick Turpin was tried right next door on this site. Another incredibly fine Georgian building, but not actually in this building itself. So this is the Crown Court of York, and it was originally the assizes for the County of York, or City of York, were held at the Guildhall near the Mansion House. But judicial matters moved here when a grand jury house was built here in 1668 and supplemented by the Sessions House of 1675. So on this location, so here where today we've got the Crown Court, this is where the trial of Dick Turpin took place in March of 1739. However, by the middle of the 18th century, the grand jury house, the place where he was tried, had become dilapidated. He was decided to demolish it and erect a new building on the same site. So this new building was commissioned to serve as the assize courts for the City of York. It was designed by John Carr in a neoclassical style, built in ashlar stone, and it was completed in 1777. So there is, in effect, about 75 years between these two buildings, the original county jail and the county courthouse. But only another 3 years would elapse before John Carr built another Georgian masterpiece over on this side, built between 1780 and 1783. Do you want to try some percussive reinforcement on your mic buzzing, please? Okay. Let me just... I'll try and move it. I wasn't aware of any percussive buzzing, but let me just move it and see if that helps. So very beautiful jails. If you're really banged up and do choky, this is definitely the... we love the green. We'll have a look at the green bear. There's the green bear over there. We'll not focus on too long people there. And this I've mentioned before, very, very similar to the design of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington. And it's believed that John Carr had entered a design competition earlier, and that the eventual successor who won the design to build 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue had seen this design and was very much influenced by it, and he was the competition winner. So that's not established truth, but nonetheless, it's widely felt. So these three buildings form the Georgian civic legal quarter of York, reflecting this new identity in the 18th century of York as the centre for justice. No longer the centre of government, at least it was going to be the centre of justice. But it's important to know that in the 18th century, Britain didn't have a police force, so that Dick Turpin and other notorious criminals seemed to be able to operate with impunity. And in particular, there's a kind of growing menace of robberies targeting isolated country properties. And in fact, in 1735, Sir William Wentworth Fitzwilliam, who was the largest landholder in the country, proposed creating a police force for what he felt was needed to protect people and property in these increasingly lawless times. But the idea at this time of a kind of standing force to control society seemed to be a stepping stone to tyranny. Britain was proud of its freedoms, and the freedom and the price of that freedom was that every citizen was expected to play a role in law enforcement. They are something, aren't they? However, what the parliamentarians could agree on was the country was living in increasingly risky times, and that the wealthy were safer in cities. So in the 18th century, another major transition that we see is the wealthy spending less and less time in their isolated country estates and more time in cities. And this is a kind of really, really important point in terms of how cities evolve in the 18th century. And of course, the 18th century is that sort of period just before modernity, isn't it? If in the Victorian world we can see the seeds of the modern world, it's the last of the pre-modern world is Georgian society. So this move away from the kind of country gent to the urban living gentry is kind of really kind of accelerated through this phase. And of course, if the gentry were going to come and live in the cities, they wanted to bring comfort with them. They wanted to live in luxury, and so we get the explosion of buildings here in York, to the social capital of the north, the home of the kind of northern aristocracy, wealthy landowners, the powerful. Pretty useful now is the Castle Museum. So we're looking at Fairfax House, one of the finest houses built anywhere in England. It was probably built in the early 1740s for a local merchant, but in 1759 it was purchased by Lord Fairfax, the 9th Viscount Fairfax of Emly, who arranged the interior to be remodelled by John Carr. And so John Carr is probably the most synonymous architect from this period. You can't really talk about Georgian England without talking about John Carr. He is far and away the most fashionable of the architects, but also the most influential in terms of his kind of stylings. And if I can just find on my little area, I've got some interior, so hopefully you'll be able to see some of the work done by, there we go, by John Carr, the interior here of Fairfax House. Beautiful parlour, and also look at the stucco ceiling work, if you can see that in terms of the interior. It's looking right down the kind of main staircase on the top row. And what else have we got? The parlour, again with very, very extensive stucco ceiling work, so decorative kind of plaster work. So what this kind of really meant was that for the craftsmen, for the tradespeople of York, for the makers, for the creators, there was suddenly this boom in trade. People wanted the best clocks, the best cutlery, the best crockery, the best furniture, artworks. So consequently, there was an absolutely enormous explosion in goods, in household furnishings. So what that meant was that created all manner of opportunities for people to come to York, to trade, and many of these craftsmen became incredibly wealthy in and of their own right, establishing firms that exist to this day. And whilst they might not have been able to afford houses on this kind of scale, many of them lived in the outer parts of the city, just outside the walls, which we'll have a look at towards the end of the tour. So as we're kind of walking through York, we see many, many examples of these houses, not just here. Castlegate House. So houses that were modelled to be, in effect, second homes, holiday homes, places where those who already had substantial country estates could come and spend time in York, often months at an end. It really does become, I think, incredibly clear the scale, the wealth, the opulence that people expected and became used to. And so only building on this kind of scale, you imagine how much furniture is required to fit it out. How many clocks needs in a house of that size? How much bed linen? Okay, how much cutlery? How much crockery? How many beds? So it sort of starts to make sense that then, whilst it becomes harder to make, for people perhaps to establish themselves in a city for makers, it's okay, it's doable because of this all this. So it becomes about no longer about sort of manufacturing on large scale or agricultural or kind of growing or textiles. All those are kind of fallen away. But artisan craftsmanship has still got a huge place in the city, and it becomes a city of makers. And as if I could have written this, City of Makers is also the city of Quakers. Now, this Friends Meeting House that we're about to see here on this side is not an 18th century building. I'll show you the original one a little bit early on. But the arrival of the Quakers into 18th century was a huge trend. Actually, they arrived 100 years earlier in the 17th century. But it's not really until the 18th century where the impact is kind of fully felt. So there's a radical change going on in faith. So Quakerism starts in pretty hanging baskets. Starts in England in the second half of the 17th century during the aftermath of the English Civil War. And it's at a time when many people were kind of interested in radically reshaping religion, politics and society. And early Quakers started preaching around the north of England and then further afield around Britain, gathering followers who were convinced by their kind of radical ideas. And the key belief in Quakerism, which you need to be careful of crossing the road here, was that within the individual you could find God. You could experience an inner light or the voice of God without needing a priest or a Bible. And that meant that Quakers didn't have a strict sense of rules, but of course it meant they were highly critical of organised religion. In fact, George Fox, famously the founder of the Quakers, was thrown out of York Minster in 1651 for preaching against an organised church. So early on, they were certainly persecuted and criminalised. But before too long, they became enormously influential on the development of the north of the city. They're called, of course, the Society of Friends is their proper name. But the Quakers, we start off as the name started off as a kind of derogatory, defamatory term, but they adopted it themselves. Is this idea of quaking in front of the word of God, and kind of showing physical manifestations of religious emotion. So, as I say, in York, that history dates back to 1651, when George Fox is thrown out of the Minster. So they shun outward forms of religion, oath-taking, formulate prayer, and they see no need for paid ministers. So you can see what a threat they become to this order. And I think it's funny, it's another part of this idea of going to 18th century, that all the old ideas are up for question. There's this idea called the Enlightenment, this new period. We've entered the age of reason, we've left behind the age of faith, and we're entering into the age of reason. So Cumberland House, another very fine Georgian property here, beautiful portico over it, dates from the early part of the 18th century. It was built in 1710 when William Cornwall, who was a tanner, so a leather worker, and a brewer, built this house as his home. I'll come around and give you the front aspect because it's a lovely riverside property here. And here we go. It's Cumberland House. It's a very fine river facade. And William Cornwall became Lord Mayor of the city in 1712 and again in 1725. And an image of this property was included by John Cossins in his new and exact plan of the city of York in 1727, which displayed fashionable new houses. It was built in brick with pronounced stone corners, or coins. We're talking about coins the other day. Give you a close-up now. That's what coins look like. And they're said to give kind of ballast. They haven't particularly got a huge sort of architectural purpose. They're there to give a sense of importance, of kind of prestige. And they're very, very important and very, very fashionable during the 18th century. So the 18th century, a great period of coins. So if you think about coins, that's what they are. But less common is the stone basement. And this has obviously been built to deal with flooding. So you can see that as we kind of go in here, you can see down there, it's very dark. We've got a stone floor. So right from the outset, this building was built to deal with and to accommodate the floodwater. It's obviously only accessible from the quayside. So frequent flooding here, always an issue. Looking forward across the bridge, and the bridge actually is from slightly later. The bridge dates from 1810. But it was still, the bridge that was here had been built in 1586, was the only bridge in York during the Georgian period. So this was the main river crossing. The old bridge resembled the Rialto in Venice, but also like the Porto Vecchio in Florence, insofar as that there'll be lots and lots of kind of businesses located. There's a courthouse, there's a chapel, there's a prison underneath, and of course you paid money to cross the bridges. They were private enterprises, and if you weren't on a bridge, the only other way you're going to cross is a ferryman. And we know there were several ferries that moved people across the river from side to side, but this was the only bridge that was present in the city. Walking up now onto Ousegate, known of course after the River Ouse. So Cumberland House, by the way, of course, was named after the Duke of Cumberland, which is kind of controversial because in some quarters he's known as Butcher Cumberland. Paul in Edinburgh loves to tell tales of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobites, but he tends to be a great deal less charitable towards the man known as Butcher Cumberland. But the people of York had reason, with their centuries of trouble with the Scots, to see the Duke of Cumberland, who was the youngest son of George II, as something of a saviour. And the fact that 3 heads of the Jacobites were placed on spikes up Micklegate Bar shows there was no love lost in York with those communities. So, just checking we can still get down here because of this. So many of these buildings above the shops, again dating into 18th century periods, interspersed with medieval churches. So it's a bit noisy here with the traffic. I'll get us through as soon as we can into kind of quieter area. So I'm just going to get a drink. Not the Jacobites, exactly, Janie. The Jacobites were, a bit disorganised, really, weren't they? It wasn't a very serious attempt to take over. So another very fine Georgian building, roving interview. I need to get across the road here and work out. I'm going to get you into Ousegate because we're installing the very 21st century anti-terrorist bollards right now. So consequently, our movement is somewhat constrained. And so we're back into down here. This is where, to stop people being able to drive in. That war should never have happened to Culloden. Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? Obviously, it depends which side of the fence or history you take a view, but ultimately, if somebody stages an uprising and seeks to take the throne by force, most countries would respond with pushback, wouldn't they? So I don't think it's particularly unusual that, of course, the Highland clearances that happen afterwards is a rather different character. But actually resisting the attempted uprising, I think, is pretty orthodox. But people are entitled to, of course, their own views about relativism and morality in history. So again, casting above the ground floor, we're straight back up into the Georgian architecture of York, and it's always working cities, spending your time not looking at the ground floor. Of course, bear in mind you can bump into people, but casting the eye upwards is where you tend to see a much more original imprint of the city and its streets, rather than the ground floor, which is very lovely, and of course they're going to make money and focus on the commercial side of things. But our upper floors tend to give us a much better sense of how the city would have been. So just letting that conversation going to play itself out through Culloden and so forth. So coming into kind of Ousegate, what we're starting to come into now is an area that is kind of transformed during the Georgian era. Insofar as at this era, the 18th century, was still trapped largely, if you like, in a medieval footprint. So in the 18th century, cities were noisy, vibrant places. Francis Drake, the city surgeon, wrote in his History of York called Ibrahim in 1736. And he made the observations that about the city, that what has been, and is the chief supporter of this city at present, is the resort to and the residence of several country gentlemen and their families in it. So he recognised that the nobility and the gentry came to York to enjoy themselves, and that their presence provided opportunity for employment and prosperity for the city. People that are happy to serve and provide services. So consequently, York were places for young people. Like Janie coming here, there was opportunities, particularly compared to rural areas where the work might be seasonal. This offered year-round secure work. And the young people were attracted by entertainments on offer, theatres, inns, pleasure gardens and shops displaying the latest fashions. And in fact, the development of window shopping as a form of recreation is strongly associated with the rise of the middle classes in the 18th century. As standards of living much improved during the 17th century, consumers from a broad range of social backgrounds begin to purchase goods that were in excess of their kind of basic necessities. And an emergent middle class or bourgeoisie stimulated demand for luxury goods. And the act of shopping keeps it a pleasurable pastime or a form of entertainment. And shopping for pleasure became a particularly important activity for middle and upper class women, since it allowed them to enter the public sphere without the need for a chaperone. So quite liberating. So prior to the 18th century, glazed shop windows were virtually unknown. Instead, shopkeepers typically had a front door with two wider openings at either side, covered with shutters. And the shutters were designed to open so that the top portion formed a canopy, while the bottom was fitted with legs so it could serve as a kind of counter, if you like. And scholars suggest that the medieval shopper's experience was essentially this. Stores just opening straight out onto the street. You wouldn't actually go into a shop. So glazed windows were incredibly rare in medieval times. It meant that shopping tours were dark places, which meant that going in was pointless. If it was too dark to see close up the goods, why bother going in? So shops rarely entered. The shoppers rarely entered the shops and had very few opportunities to inspect the goods prior to purchase. So glazing was widely used in the early 18th century. And I'm telling you this as walking down here because this is a street, Parliament Street, transformed during the Georgian era to allow space for promenading and fashionable shops. This was opened out. What would have been a maze of narrow medieval shops is now created in a broad arcade, a public space, a place to sort of promenade. And the shops would have put glass in, meaning, of course, that people can then wander up and down and look at the fancy goods that are for sale. So the availability of plate glass in the 18th century becomes more widespread, it goes down in price. So this allowed the full length of shop windows to be created and the display of merchandise to draw in customers. So you can get a few things in play by creating these big wide open spaces where you get more light. That in turn inspires the creation of the modern shopfront that we have today, which I find is really interesting. Of course, one thing they didn't like was that in creating these big open spaces, they became populated by the urban poor. Because the urban poor, of course, were living in areas that were very, very narrow, very kind of constrained, if you like, there's a space, but living on top of another. So when they created these big, wide open vistas, the first thing that happened was you got congregations of the urban poor. So that really wasn't at all what they think of. They were hoping to create these spaces for themselves, but instead they create spaces for every man. And of course with that goes crime, pickpockets, and so forth. So the next thing is they move on to creating arcades. They loved an arcade in the Georgian era, a covered space, lots of fancy metalwork, and so things like the Tunbridge Wells was famous, the pantiles, for the arcades down there, but they were all about keeping the urban poor out. And one such arcade ran the length of York, beautiful. So rather kind of more modern, we're working towards kind of Petergate. So I just want to show you a couple of kind of properties down here as we walk through. So it's kind of important to recognise that this 18th century is a period of total transformation of York. And whilst York had fallen off its kind of pedigree as York's second city, it's probably York's third. Norwich had emerged as England's second city, but York is still there as third place. So it hasn't kind of fallen completely. But what we see at this period of time is a total transformation of the street scene. Vistas are opened up. These narrow medieval alleyways, characterised, as we know, by the shambles and so forth, begin to become sidelined as shopping destinations. What people want is width and light, the ability to move around with their carriages, keep safe, and so forth, and of course we have to display merchandise and goods. So the very nature of the street scene changes completely. And so we're coming now into Petergate, which hasn't got so many Georgian buildings, but one lovely one, which I want to show you. Sorry about that. And so let's take you down. It's kind of busy down here. So what's building? I'm sorry, Elizabeth, I only just come through, so I don't know. But if you send me a picture of it, I can let you know. So this period of kind of transition away from the medieval buildings towards the more modern buildings, we can immediately recognise in terms of the aesthetics, this old style of what are called jetted buildings. So where buildings go from smaller to larger to largest, was completely swept away in the Georgian era. And this medieval style was replaced by the geometric styling, so we can see that most prominent in Stonegate. Before we do, another very, very fine, one of the finest Georgian houses in England, just here, 62 Petergate. So this was built for a chap called John Shaw, who worked for the court at York, and it was on the site of the former Talbot Inn. So it had been a pub which come out of here, so we can just get in. So again, another beautiful house here for us to feast our eyes on. You can only imagine the wealth that it cost to build a house on this kind of scale in the city centre. So after Shaw's death, it was rented by Henry Hindley, around about 1730 rather, who's a famous clock and watchmaker who supplied the clocks to both the Mansion House and York Minster. And after he died, it became the house of Dr. Alexander Hunter, who plays a key role in the final story of today about York Lunatic Asylum, a big scandal of York and Georgian England. But isn't it just an absolutely stunning property? It's now a lovely Italian restaurant, and it's very easy, no window tax problem here now, very easy to kind of wander past. So busy, but just take a moment to look at the quality of the architecture, the buildings. And so this is a classic example of Georgian architecture here. We've got pure symmetry. So, you know, the top and the bottom, we've got precision, everything's square. The portico adds a neoclassical elegance, so drawing links between the modern world, the 18th century world, and the Roman world, the Greek world of civilization. So they're saying, we too are a great civilization, unlike the people that built these, to them, ugly buildings, the medieval buildings. They're creating precision and design. It's a world in control. So they really are. It was a girls' school for many years, York College for Girls, but now I say it's an Italian restaurant. But it's this idea, this age of enlightenment, the age of reason, about man's control of the world. So it's a different post-Reformation perspective that sees man as being an architect. No longer God the architect, now it's man the architect that builds buildings to, if you like, show what men and humanity can create, rather than everything being in service to God. It's a very kind of different mindset that emerges and becomes very, very prominent in the 18th century. So 18th century life would have been very confusing and chaotic, busy streets today, and this street hasn't changed hugely since that kind of period. The kind of narrow alleyways and lanes that characterise York had remained unchanged in medieval times. So famous Snickelways. You're going to do a Snickelways tour of York very soon. But all these narrow alleyways, these narrow streets, largely unchanged in the medieval times. So the streets of 18th century York would have echoed to the din of horse-drawn traffic, clattering on the cobblestones, and the kind of hubbub, like today, of people engaged, and music, of course. Then there's now street entertainment, the normal course. How's it going? Always a reason to stop and look, see what's going on in York. So yeah, a classic example there. It hasn't really changed that much. It's vibrant streets, they're noisy, they're busy. But of course we would have had hackney carriages clattering along the streets, making a terrible row. Hundreds of carts being transported kind of back and forth with these goods. So with all these people, you've got huge demands for foodstuffs, for luxury goods. And it's all being ferried on carts and traffic and horse-drawn traffic along these, as well as, of course, the conveyance of wealthy people to their place of business. And these pedestrians hurrying to and fro. So I mentioned in terms of about how the city evolved. And we look at Stonegate here, and we see on one side of the street, a city street that has largely retained its identity. These buildings date from the 1340s, some of the oldest houses in York. When we pan across the other side of the street, it seems they've been replaced by elegant Georgian buildings. If we look, we see very characteristic Georgian precision, completely different architectural styles. But it's not actually the case. What we're seeing is architectural kind of redrawing of these buildings. So consequently, again, looking down this side, they're stuck right in the middle. We see what happens if it's left too. So in this case, the building has been left entire with its jetted frontage. In the others, they've been cut away. So for those who didn't quite have the deep enough pockets to have a new house built for them, you could nonetheless refashion and restyle your house in the latest Georgian fashions. And of course, down at the ground floor, we're starting to see some of the historic glass that we talked about earlier, glazed frontages of the Cat Gallery, just past Cat Gallery, absolutely. So a real kind of mishmash is Stonegate. But of course, these streets that were narrow weren't really that suitable for carriages. The carriages would often kind of get stuck, causing traffic congestion and chaos. So this is at the time where we're going to come into the square at the top in just a minute, of opening up. So like Parliament Street and Helen Square, these squares start to open up with places where you can actually control the flow of traffic, as you might say, control the actual way of kind of flowing through the city, giving it a chance, creating roundabouts almost within the city for the movement of the commercial vehicles. So it begins to be opened up to create the city we recognise today. As I say, those merchants that weren't quite on the level of affording a new Georgian house could, some more here, refashion a medieval property. So bow windows, another characteristic of the Georgian era, very fashionable at their time. So St Helens Square originally would have been a mishmash of streets, a marketplace, but was opened up to create a square. Not least because this was chosen as the residence for the Lord Mayor of York. So the Mansion House just coming into view for us now. And the Mansion House, of course, is the oldest purpose-built residence for a Lord Mayor anywhere in England, even older than the home of the Lord Mayor of London. And this was really about the need for York to display its prestige, to continue to attract the super wealthy, and to provide a place where it could entertain them, where it could provide facilities for dining with some of the richest, most influential people in the country. And so whilst York had lost its national importance, it still administered the county's affairs, and so it's sufficiently important to have a Lord Mayor continue and for him to have his own residence. Up until this point, the Lord Mayor had moved from place to place, and the civic regalia had moved with him, but it was said that much was lost, or perhaps conveniently lost, along the way. And so it was decided, so 1725 onwards, there was a need for a purpose-built mansion. It opened in the early 1730s. Wonderful residence of the Lord Mayor of York. And so the corporation in this period still consisted of the Lord Mayor and 12 aldermen. And they were no longer really interested in taking the city forward. They were interested in keeping the wealthy people here. So opportunity in York, other than in the supply of luxury goods, had all but dried up. But nonetheless, the ability to host and entertain super wealthy in the capital, the social capital of the north, was very much the focal point. So the upper salon here is doesn't feel like August. Upper salon here, the beautiful interior designed to host royalty, the crowned heads, and the super wealthy. We should get another drink. I'm just getting a bit dry. So very noisy, very busy in York, but hopefully the internet signal is just about holding up. So yeah, the weather for August this year has been very disappointing, to say the least. So again, an argument for looking up in York is made here. We're coming up to the House of Trembling Madness, which of course is a very well-known hostelry in York. Very funky place to go for a drink and a bite to eat. But if we look above, we see it is actually 3 houses together, formed a Georgian mansion, and this was the house of Sir William Wentworth in York, the chap I spoke about earlier, who was so concerned about robberies that he suggested the creation of a police force in England. And it was widely derided. He didn't get any support, but nonetheless, there was still this sense that the protection of people and property was far more important than the lives of the poor. The notorious Black Act came in, making it in effect a hanging offence to do pretty much anything against property or people in this country. So the original portico there, the Georgian house, William Fitzwilliam. You can see again the size of these properties really is fabulous. And another very significant property over on our left hand side here is what became known as the Judges' Lodgings. So the Judges' Lodgings was originally built between 1711 and 1726, and this land originally was part of St Wilfrid's Church, which had been demolished in the 16th century. In fact, when they dug this out, they found a boneyard, which obviously had been the burial pit underneath. But it was opened up in 1736 for a chap called Clifton Wintringham, and he was obviously a very, very wealthy merchant. But this is a superbly well-fitted house. Now it's a very popular bar and restaurant, the Judges' Lodgings. If I can just go in a bit of zoom, you can just see the crest there. You've got Aeschylus, he's the head above the door, I believe, the garlands of grape and wine, a place of great entertainment. So again, you're just looking at the lavishness of these residences that were built for people. And I say they weren't built to be their main residence. These were built to be a part-time residence, a holiday home, for want of a better description. Such was the wealth that was available that, again, just come from this side of you, another view. Just imagine what it takes to fit out a house in that size in terms of furniture, beds, fabrics, curtains, you name it. You've got a vast, vast amount to fill. So with this becoming the focal point, the social centre, and people might say, why was York the social centre of the north? Well, London was a 4-day carriage ride away on roads that were unfinished. So they were pitted roads, very uncomfortable and dangerous, of course, highwaymen, as we know. So travelling to London for your entertainment was a big ask, particularly you could do that in York instead. So consequently, York becomes, if you like, the alternate capital of England for the north. And so with so many descending here, having houses built for them, of course what it needs is a big social hub. And so consequently, they call on Lord Burlington, who is the most kind of successful and fashionable architect of his day, the Burlington Arcade in London, most famously one of his, to build and design the assembly rooms. So in 1730, he is contracted to start building a social centre here, and you can see, if you look around the corner, it's right underneath the shadow of the Minster. For those that are wondering kind of where we're located, coming back down into Blake Street. It may be that Burlington designed the Mansion House as well. We don't actually know. He's suggested that he did, but it's not entirely clear. What he did build here, which is based on an Egyptian temple, is arguably York's finest of the Georgian buildings. It really is absolutely superb. And of course the interior is utterly resplendent. Italian marble and every degree. It's now a pizza restaurant. It's well worth going in to just have a look at the interior. because it is sumptuous and splendid. And so this was built as the social centre. In particular, there was a very fashionable card salon in the back. The Georgian gentry loved to play gambling games with cards. But more than that, it was a place of socialisation, a place of dancing, and a place to bring out your sons and daughters in society. Because these upper echelons of society were totally obsessed with finding an appropriate match. Think kind of Jane Austen and that kind of side of things, you know? It's that sense of being brought out to find a young man of means, a man of kind of wealth, because the greatest way, of course, of maintaining wealth is through marriage, right? A good marriage can elevate both sides. So I'm not going to be able to take us in, but you just get a sense here of just quite how beautiful the interior is. Ask Italian. So do come check out Ask Italian. You see the columns right through the middle there. So finding a good match, a man of property or wealth, or equally for a man to find an heiress that was going to come into money, was a fantastic way to, in fact, protect your income for generations to come. So that really was the focal point of the assembly rooms, for the Georgian society to come together, to dance, to dine, and to create these, not necessarily love matches, but certainly kind of financial matches that were going to be responsible for generating hereditary wealth for the generations to come. So I think you can just sort of see, if I can pull back, quite how grand this building is. And very little unchanged from the 18th century. It really is, I think, just incredible, you know, kind of exercise. Again, we're looking at this kind of neoclassical style. So looking at the columns, it's harking back to an Egyptian temple. And it's comparing them, saying they were great and so are we. It's this almost innate arrogance that we have of the period. It's got a Venetian-style arch surrounds the door. You know, it is absolutely beautiful. Grade 1 listed, of course, and it's one of the earliest Palladian buildings in northern Britain. So finished by 1735. Now there's another very fine building that I would love to have shown you over here. But as you can see, right now it's covered in scaffolding. So not much point in talking about that, but it is the Red House. And the Red House was the original house of the Lord Mayor in York. But the MP of the city, Sir William Robinson, decided he liked living here so much that basically he paid for the mansion as to be built instead, so he could stay living here. It's famous these days as being an antique centre. The chap, anybody that watches British TV might recognise a chap called Tim Hogarth, regularly appears on ITV Antiques Things, and this is his place, his antique centre. So that's in the Red House. So we're kind of coming round now into a building that is slightly after our period. The plans for this emerged right at the end of the kind of Georgian period in the 1820s. This crescent, so it's not quite 18th century, a little bit later on, but the idea was clear. They were clearing this area. This had been the Mint Yard, it was called, of York, the area of the Exchequer. Huge hoards of coins were found in this area. So whilst it's a little bit later in our period, it's very much in keeping with it, in creating city centre residences for the super wealthy to come and spend a few months at a time in York. And of course, while they're here, they want another building covered in scaffolding, just to frustrate us. They wanted entertainment. So in the 1740s, we get the Theatre Royal. Opens up on the site of a former convent, right in the city centre. So again, it's about providing entertainment, places for the wealthy to come and spend their leisure time. So it's opened in 1744 on the site of the former St Leonard's Medieval Hospital, and parts of the hospital can still be seen inside. So when we just pan in, you see the sort of working stone columns. Inside, if you can see without the reflection, you're looking at the medieval hospital within the. And we think that in this area we've got lots of Roman architecture. So in 1744, a theatre replaced the theatre originally was in Minster Yard. It's not too far away from here. It was built by Thomas Kerrigan with the encouragement of the City Corporation. It's got a very modern annex off from the 1970s. But I say this became the focal point of socialisation for these super wealthy people. And Tate Wilkinson in 1769 paid £500 for a royal patent. In other words, he got the name Theatre Royal because he knew in doing so, making it a theatre royal, not just a theatre, that would bring in the wealthy, it would make it attractive. And he was certainly successful, he was hugely successful in its own kind of time period. And still to this day, he's one of only a handful of theatre royals up and down the country. Again, stunning de grey rooms, we passed by, early 19th century, but again, very much representing the grandeur of the 18th century of Georgian York and its ambition, as is the art gallery over on our left-hand side. And we're just going to bring you up to kind of finish up down Bootham. I think we're 10 minutes to go, so perfect time. Can't compete with that. So for those that like it, orientation, which is our Bootham Bar, we'll start many tours down here. But we're bypassing Bootham Bar right now, it's on Bootham Street itself. And Bootham is an absolute kind of treasure house of Georgian architecture. So, for those that wanted a Georgian house, there was three main options. The first, if your pockets are deep enough, was to have a house built for you right in the centre. Like we saw Petergate, like we saw with Judge's Lodgings, like we saw with Fairfax House. That's option one. Option two is, if you've got the money, buy something central and get an architect to refashion it for you in the latest style. Option three, which is more affordable for most, is to build a house outside the city walls. And that's what a lot of the artisans, the kind of creators, the successful business people of York did, was rather than build inside the walls, to build outside the walls. And to Bootham, the street that kind of runs out the Great North Road, we're going to walk up now, that very much kind of encapsulates that. It is the biggest kind of concentration of fabulous Georgian properties to be found in the city. And as soon as we get across these lights, I'm going to share that with you. But that could take anywhere up to 2 to 10 minutes, depending on what the lights feel like there. Oh, here we are. So Bootham comes from the word booth. Lots of market stalls really appear through the medieval period. But forget about the medieval period, we're interested in the Georgian. The first of the fantastic buildings we're going to hit in a minute is Wandersford House. It's going to be on our right-hand side, which was an almshouse, still operating to this day, for 12 Christian women, widows that could live a life of Christian purity without having recourse to borrowing or doing anything that might besmirch their reputations. But after that, it is literally cheek by jowl. That every house down here is listed, pretty much, and most of them from the Georgian period, and most of them built to an exquisite pattern. And they're very much associated with the Quakers. So we talked a little bit earlier about the Quakers of York and how it had grown up in the north. But in the 18th century, the Quakers themselves began to enjoy financial success. And so that success then began to equate to power. So, excuse me. So as they established successful businesses, as they made money, they could start to use that money to deliver, if you like, on their values, on their belief systems. So whilst this isn't a Quaker institution, it's a good example. So Wandersford House, beautiful Georgian mansion here, that's used for a home for Christian women, is money that's been endowed. It's been put down by a group of people that have a belief system and want to put that belief system into action. So it's faith into action. And with the Quakers, that was education. They firmly believed in creating Quaker education. So all this now is all beautiful listed Georgian housing. Each one slightly different, all 18th century, all these magnificent porticos, doorways, absolutely wonderful kind of collection of Georgian architecture here on Bootham. And they were very interested, of course, they ended up in chocolate. The Quakers, because they were anti-alcohol, And it was believed that you could sustain a working man not just with beer, but with chocolate. And so this was the argument. You couldn't bring in temperance and get rid of alcohol because working men with physical jobs needed that alcohol in order to sustain them, put their back into it all day long. So drinking chocolate was created. The famous Rowntree family of York, famous chocolate Quakers. So Joseph Rowntree lives here on Bootham. So this was the area. Bootham is the Quaker centre. And so all these buildings we're passing now on my right-hand side form Bootham School, a Quaker educational institution here right in the city, based on Bootham, the streets of the Quakers in York. And again, let me just pan around so you can have a look at the quality of the architecture to offer in this street. It really is phenomenal. Just being careful, I don't want to film anybody coming in and out of school because obviously they're young people. York's registry office there on our left. But again, Bootham School, 200 years of Quaker education in York, as you can see. Again, the stone coins we talked about earlier, everything has got this grandeur. So yeah, by going into chocolate, they believe they were combating the demon drink. But there's one more area where they were to prove to be incredibly successful, and that is in the treatment of people with mental health problems. Because the final building that we're going to look at on this tour, when it was closed about 10 years ago, it was called, no, not that long ago, it was called Bootham Psychiatric Hospital. But it was built as York's lunatic asylum. That was the name. Luna, of course, supposed to be Luna the moon. They believed that people were affected by the cycles of the moon to lunatics. And so it was decided in the latter part of the 1700s, in 1773, that there was a need for a county lunatic asylum here at York. And so 24 gentlemen came together to purchase the land we're about to walk through the park of for the site of the hospital. So in 1772, Robert Hay Drummond, the Archbishop of York, came together with 24 Yorkshire gentlemen to establish an asylum. So again, this is part of this age of enlightenment. The idea being, of course, to provide great care for people. That's what you think, right? So a committee was established. John Carr, the architect, was brought in with a pledge of 25 guineas. The March of Rockingham pledged 100 guineas. And in total, £2,500 was subscribed by July 1773. Eventually, that went to £5,000. And Carr's scheme then to accommodate 54 patients was approved on the 25th of August. And the building was completed in 1777. You probably see it at the edge of your picture by now. So York Lunatic Asylum opened in 1777. And at the time, it was very little understood about mental illness. And without organised institutional care available, families were left to deal with the mentally ill at home as well as they could. And it was usual to chain lunatics to walls and leave them naked because it was believed that lunatics couldn't feel the cold, believe it or not. And that madness literally turned people into animals. And that although there was kind of grand ideals where it was first conceived of providing kind of relief for these unhappy sufferers who were the objects of terror and compassion, York Lunatic Asylum soon kind of fell into a darker path. And in 1790, a Quaker woman called Hannah Mills died here at York Asylum. And no friends, no Quakers had been allowed to see her during her 6-week residence. They wanted to come and help her support her faith. They weren't allowed. Equally, they weren't allowed to see the conditions in which she was being held. And this led William Tuke, a leading Quaker of the city, to encourage the foundation of the retreats in York, an institution built on the Quaker idea that everybody should be treated kindly and as an equal. So concerns about York Asylum continued to grow. After William Vickers was badly treated by the staff at the asylum, a Justice of the Peace for the West Riding called Godfrey Higgins started investigating the case. Now, vicars had been released from the hospital bruised, lousy, dirty, so covered in louses, and so weak he could hardly stand. And other poorly treated patients were discovered. A Reverend Shorey, who'd been kicked down the stairs by his keeper, and Martha Kidd, whose hip was dislocated during her stay. A meeting was called to examine Higgins' accusations, and nearly 40 local gentlemen, including members of the Tuke family, took advantage of an old rule and paid £20 in order to qualify as governors of the asylum and to effect change. So investigation discovered a number of the patients at the asylum had been growing, but poor financial management meant the institution was struggling and conditions were getting ever worse. And this should have caused a higher death rate, but the figures in the asylum annual accounts didn't reflect this. In other words, they hid the numbers of people in there, numbers of deaths in there. It was crooked. The closer examination of Stewart's books made it clear that deaths had been concealed. In addition, it was discovered that physicians in the asylum had misappropriated significant sums of money from the institution, and before further assessments could be made, a fire began which destroyed one wing of the asylum and all, conveniently, of its records. So rumours said it had been set to by the steward deliberately to conceal the truth. This was never proven, and Dr. Best was never charged for fraud, but he was forced to resign. So affluent patients at the asylum were generally well treated. It was the poor that suffered. And a surprise inspection in March 1814, Godfrey Higgins insisted that staff opened locked doors near the kitchen. It was claimed the key couldn't be found, but he threatened to break open the doors with a poker. Finally, he gained entrance and found a secret number of cells in a state of filth horrible beyond description, full of female patients, the most miserable objects I ever beheld. Elsewhere you might see 100 poor creatures shut up together, unattended and uninspected by anyone. In August 1814 at the Governor's Annual Court, new rules were made and the officers of the asylum were all dismissed, and the staff were replaced with help from the retreat hospital. In the aftermath there was a full inquiry. But most importantly, what this scandal led to was a new focusing on the treatment of people with mental health, led by the Quakers, who again used action rather than words. They built the retreat and they helped to create the new world. And that to me is a summary of 18th century in York. We're just about over our time. You want to be dipping off. So I do hope you've enjoyed that. You found that an interesting experience. We've seen some different buildings, some different ways of thinking about York. But isn't it wonderful to show you so much of the city that on other tours I've missed out. So thank you so much for joining me here today in York. Hopefully you can join me in Ilkley on Thursday, and I look forward to seeing you then. So everybody who stayed, thank you very much, and I will see you again very, very soon. So I'll just come a bit closer, you can just get a sight of the frontage of this, one of the finest Georgian buildings, but one with a rather tragic history. That of a place of abuse of people with very, very significant and profound mental health problems. But that all happened right here. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to leave you. Helen, I'm glad you've enjoyed it. Thank you. Some lovely buildings in York for you to enjoy. So thank you, everybody. I look forward to seeing you very, very soon. Do subscribe, follow, etc., etc., all that stuff. And for those who left a tip, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It helps with everything right now. So goodbye. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.